Decidedly, one of the most notorious and infamous serial killers in history, his appetite for dominance and control over those he desired led to a series of depraved and cruel murders with a degree of vulgarity that is rarely ever seen. In tonight's episode, we discuss the Milwaukee cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer. Let's open the serial killer file. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 as the oldest of two sons to Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. From an early age, Jeffrey noted the tense relationship between his parents, both of whom doted on him but were also emotionally neglectful. His father's studies in chemistry at Marquette University often kept him away, while his mother suffered from various ailments, including an addiction to tranquilizers, and she was described as argumentative, attention-seeking, and neurotic. His parents relentlessly argued, with his mother needing constant attention from her husband. As a result, Jeffrey grew up a withdrawn, reserved child with few friends in his early years. During his high school years, Jeffrey was known as a lonely outcast with a reputation for pulling pranks. Teachers in his freshman year regarded him as polite and highly intelligent, but apathetic towards school and friendships. However, at age 14, Jeffrey began abusing alcohol heavily and often smuggled beer and liquor into school in his coat lining. He quickly realized he was gay during puberty, and in his late teens he began having dark sexual fantasies involving domination and assaulting an unconscious person, gradually linking dissection into these fantasies. On one occasion, he hid with a baseball bat, intending to attack, render unconscious, and sexually assault a male jogger that he had found attractive. Though he didn't carry out this plan, it was his first noted desire to attack another person. His grades declined in his senior year due to the impending separation of his parents. Despite attending marriage counseling, they ultimately divorced. The separation started cordially but soon turned to fighting in front of Jeffrey and his younger brother David, which resulted in Lionel moving to a local motel. Shortly before his high school graduation in May of 1978, Jeffrey turned 18, and Joyce was awarded custody of David, and she moved in with relatives in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Jeffrey's first murder occurred on June 18, 1978. Living in the family home alone in the aftermath of his parents' divorce, he picked up 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, who was hitchhiking to a concert in a nearby town. Jeffrey lured Stephen to his home under the guise of drinking together. When Stephen tried to leave, Jeffrey bludgeoned him unconscious with a 10-pound dumbbell and strangled him to death. After pleasuring himself over the body, he dissected it in his crawl space. He buried the body in a shallow grave in his backyard for several weeks, but later dissolved the flesh in acid and flushed the remains down the toilet before crushing and scattering the bones in a nearby forest. Soon after Stephen's murder, Lionel Dahmer moved back in with his new fiancée, and Jeffrey enrolled at Ohio State University as a business major. However, Jeffrey only lasted one term, dropping out due to his rampant alcohol abuse. The following year, Jeffrey enlisted in the Army, training as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston before being sent to Baumholder, West Germany on July 13, 1979, to serve as a combat medic. His alcoholism eventually resulted in his formal discharge in March of 1981. Years later, two fellow soldiers reported being sexually assaulted by Jeffrey during their time in Germany. Returning to the United States on March 24, 1981, Jeffrey felt unable to face his father in the wake of his failed Army service, so he decided to move to Miami Beach, Florida. He spent 6 months there, working in a deli and living in a motel, but his alcohol abuse resulted in his eviction. He lived on the beach while continuing to work before finally returning home to live with his father and stepmother in September. Jeffrey continued heavily drinking and was arrested for drunken disorderly conduct shortly after his return. His father tried to help, but ultimately, in 1981, sent Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. At first, the change proved positive. Jeffrey found work and lived amicably with his grandmother, despite her objection to his drinking. However, things didn't stay that way. Jeffrey was arrested for exposing himself to a crowd of women and children at the Wisconsin State Fair Park, and later in 1986, after exposing himself to 2 young boys, for which he received 1 year's probation and mandatory counseling. Jeffrey frequented the Milwaukee gay scene in early 1985, having reawakened his fantasies of sexual assault and domination. He visited bathhouses but found himself dissatisfied with his partner's movements during the sexual encounters. By mid-1986, he began drugging and assaulting the men. The bathhouses revoked his membership, and he turned to hotel rooms for his depraved rendezvous. During this time, Jeffrey also attempted to steal the body of a recently deceased teenager to keep the body in his home. However, this plan failed because the soil was too hard to dig up. On September 15, 1987, Jeffrey invited 25-year-old Stephen Tuomi back to his room at the Ambassador Hotel. Only intending to drug and assault the man, Jeffrey found Stephen dead the next morning. His chest crushed in and Jeffrey's hands and arms covered in damning bruises. Having no recollection of the murder, Jeffrey left the body in the hotel room and went to purchase a suitcase. He transported the body to his grandmother's house, where he spent hours dismembering and disposing of the body in trash bags. He kept the head, however, cleaning and preserving it in a bleach detergent solution in hopes of keeping it for sexual purposes, but it was too brittle and was eventually disposed of. After, Jeffrey found himself seeking out men to murder, luring them to their deaths at his grandmother's home, all without her ever finding out. His next victim was a 14-year-old prostitute named James Doxtator, whom he lured to his home under the guise of paying him for nude photos and sex. Jeffrey drugged and strangled him to death, hiding his body in the cellar for a week before disposing of the remains the same way he had with Stevens. On March 24, 1988, Jeffrey met 22-year-old Richard Guerrero outside of a gay bar and offered him $50 to hang out with him for the night. He drugged and strangled Richard to death, performed acts of necrophilia on the body, and repeated the same process of disposing it afterwards. One victim managed to escape thanks to Jeffrey's grandmother, who arrived home after he gave the young man a coffee laced with sedatives. Jeffrey attempted to hide the fact that he wasn't alone, but his grandmother noticed his guest, leading to his survival. In September of 1988, Jeffrey's grandmother grew tired of him bringing men home and of the terrible smells emitting from the basement and garage. She asked him then to move out. He found residence in an apartment on North 25th Street, and less than a day after moving in, he was arrested for drugging and molesting 13-year-old Kyson Synthesumphone, who escaped after Jeffrey enticed him into the apartment to pose nude for photos. Jeffrey was convicted of sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes in January of 1989. Between his conviction and his sentencing, he temporarily moved back in with his grandmother and killed his 5th victim, 26-year-old Anthony Sears. The pair returned to Jeffrey's grandmother's house, where they engaged in oral sex before Jeffrey drugged and strangled him to death. Jeffrey found Anthony extremely attractive and was determined to preserve some part of his victim. He attempted to flay Anthony's body before resorting to his usual disposal method, though he was successful in preserving his head and his genitals, which he stowed in his work locker.